31 reels. That's how many I had lined up on my studio bench 3 weeks ago, each one labeled in handwriting I hadn't seen in 26 years. And by the time I'd restored and listened to all of them, everything my mother had told me about my father since I was 9 years old turned out to be a story she'd built to protect herself, not me. I'm Odessa 38, and I restore analog audio for a living. Old reels, damaged cassettes, degraded recordings archives can't play anymore without losing them entirely. I want to start you here in my studio 3 weeks into this because I need you to understand what it actually sounds like to hear your dead father's voice for the first time since you were a child, coming out of a machine you built yourself to save exactly this kind of thing. Let me back up, though, because none of this makes sense without 26 years of what I thought was true. My father, Gideon, left when I was 9. That's the version I grew up with. My mother, Corinne, told it the same way every time it came up at every birthday, every holiday, every version of me old enough to ask a new question about him. He left because he couldn't handle a family. He left because he didn't love us enough to stay. He left specifically because of me, a detail she never softened not once, not even when I was small enough that hearing it should have felt cruel even to her. I believed her for over 2 decades. I want to be honest about that because I think some of you have believed a version of your own family's story for exactly that long too, and it matters to say it plainly. I didn't doubt her. Why would I have? She was the one who stayed. She was the one who raised me alone, worked 2 jobs some years, sat through every school play by herself. The math seemed simple. She stayed. He left. Stayed people tell the truth. Left people don't get to explain themselves anymore. I have exactly one memory of my father from before he left, and I used to think it was the only real one I had. A kitchen early morning, him lifting me onto the counter to reach a cereal box, saying my name wrong on purpose because it made me laugh every single time. I held on to that memory for years the way you hold on to a photograph that started to fade carefully, rarely afraid that looking at it too often would wear it out completely. My mother never contradicted the memory itself. She just built everything around it into something smaller and colder than it had actually been. My mother moved into a memory care facility 8 months ago. Early-stage dementia, the kind that comes and goes, some days sharper than others, most days not. Cleaning out her house afterward fell to me mostly since my brother Rowan lives out of state and could only fly in for a weekend. He'd grown up with a different version of events than I had, honestly, 3 years older enough distance from 9-year-old me, that his memories of our father were sparser, less anchored to any single story. When I called to tell him about moving her things, he mostly wanted to know if there was anything worth keeping, practically furniture and paperwork, nothing sentimental. I didn't tell him about the box until much later. I wasn't ready to yet, and some part of me wanted to be sure of what it actually meant before I handed him a version of our childhood that might undo something he'd made peace with a long time ago. I found the box on the second day, pushed into the very back of the attic behind Christmas decorations nobody had touched in a decade, taped shut, my own name written on the top in handwriting that wasn't my mother's. 31 reel-to-reel tapes, a handful of cassettes, a small stack of letters unopened addressed to me at an old childhood address, postmarked over a span of 11 years, every single one still sealed. I sat on that attic floor for a long time before I touched anything else. Stick with me here because what those tapes actually said didn't come all at once. It came in pieces over 3 weeks of restoration work, and every piece changed what the last one meant. I recognized my father's handwriting on the real labels immediately, even after 26 years. Dates. Just dates, nothing else, going back to the year he left running almost continuously up until 11 years ago, when they simply stopped. I ran my thumb across the first label for a long time before I loaded anything into the machine the way you might touch a photograph of someone you're not sure you're ready to look at fully yet. I brought the box back to my studio instead of opening the letters first. I told myself it was because the tapes were more fragile, more time-sensitive, more at risk of degrading if I waited, which was true professionally, the same reasoning I'd give any client. It was also, I think now, a way of putting off the letters a little longer, choosing the version of the truth that would take me weeks to reach, instead of the one I could read in an afternoon. The restoration process itself takes longer than people expect. Reel-to-reel tape this old is brittle, prone to what's called sticky shed syndrome, where the binder holding the magnetic particles to the tape backing starts breaking down, and the oxide begins flaking off the moment you try to play it. Before I could even listen to a single second of these recordings, I had to bake each reel in a low-temperature oven for hours, a process that temporarily restores enough structural integrity to get one clean playback, sometimes only one before the tape degrades past usability entirely. I want you to understand that every one of these recordings, once I started, only had a single real chance to be heard correctly. There was no undo button, no second attempt if I got it wrong. I baked the first reel overnight the way you would with any client's fragile media, telling myself I was being professionally careful, not personally hesitant, though I think both were probably true at once. The first reel I restored was dated the same month my father supposedly left. His voice came through the speakers, rough, a little warped from age, but unmistakably him, a voice I hadn't heard since I was 9, saying my name the way he always had, with the emphasis on the wrong syllable, a family joke nobody else ever got right. He said he didn't know if this recording would ever reach me. He said he hoped someday it would. He said he loved me, and that whatever anyone told me about why he wasn't there anymore, he needed me to know that leaving hadn't been his choice. I stopped the tape there. I didn't touch the second reel for 4 days. Those 4 days weren't idle exactly. I kept working other clients, other people's damaged wedding videos and family recordings, going through the motions of a job I'm usually good enough at to do half distracted. Twice that week, I caught myself staring at the shelf where the remaining 30 reels sat still boxed, and had to physically make myself turn back to the project actually in front of me. My assistant at the studio, a quiet, observant guy who's worked with me for 2 years, asked on the 3rd day if everything was all right. I told him it was a complicated personal restoration, which was true enough not to feel like a lie, and left it there. He didn't push. I think he could tell the way people sometimes can, that whatever it was wasn't ready to be talked about yet. I need to tell you something about myself the same way I'd want you to be honest with me. I spent a good part of those 4 days trying to find a version of this that didn't require rethinking 26 years of my life. Maybe the tape was staged. Maybe he was manipulating a version of the truth just as much as she had. I've restored enough old recordings professionally to know that audio alone doesn't prove intent. It proves someone said something, not that what they said was true. I ran through every alternative explanation I could think of during those 4 days, mostly at 2 a.m, staring at the studio ceiling instead of sleeping. Maybe he'd recorded these for someone else entirely, and I was simply misreading my own name on a label. Maybe grief mine had made me hear affection in a recording that was actually something colder. I cataloged each possibility carefully the way I'd catalog anything before trusting it. And one by one, none of them survived contact with what I actually knew was on that tape. There's a specific kind of doubt that comes from doing this job for as long as I have. I've handled recordings clients swore were authentic that turned out on close inspection to be later re-recordings dressed up with artificial hiss and wow and flutter, to sound older than they were. I've also handled the reverse, genuine, decades-old material that clients assumed had to be fake, because what was said on it was simply too inconvenient to have actually happened. I didn't know that week which version of doubt I was actually sitting in. I only knew I owed myself the same rigor I'd give any client before I let myself believe anything. So I did what I actually know how to do. I called Tobias, a colleague I trust completely, who specializes in forensic audio dating, the kind of verification museums and legal teams use to confirm a recording's actual age against claimed provenance. I asked him to run the reel's independently tape stock oxide degradation pattern recording equipment signature without telling him anything about what was on them. He came back within a week. Every reel matched its labeled date within a plausible margin. This wasn't something recorded recently and dressed up to look old. These were reel made when they claimed to be made over a span of 11 consecutive years. That answered one question. It cracked open a much bigger one, because if my father had genuinely been trying to reach me for 11 years, someone had been making sure those recordings never did. I want to pause here because I know some of you have found out something about your own childhood that reorganizes everything that came before it. If that's you, I see you, and I promise the next part of this is worth staying for, because it's the part that actually explains why. I finally opened the letters. Most were from my father, directly brief dated across those same 11 years, each one describing an attempt to reach me a birthday card sent to my school, instead of home a phone call that got cut off mid-sentence and never reconnected a request through a mutual family friend that apparently went nowhere. But one letter near the bottom of the stack wasn't from him at all. It was from my Aunt Faustina, my father's sister, dated 14 years ago, addressed to me but somehow never delivered, apparently mailed to my mother's house by mistake, and simply never forwarded. Faustina's letter said something my father's own recordings hadn't. She wrote that she'd tried more than once to explain to me directly what had actually happened, and that my mother had asked her repeatedly not to interfere, insisting it would only confuse a child who was already old enough to understand the truth as she'd told it. I called Faustina that same afternoon. She's 81 now, sharp as ever, and she told me a version of my parents' separation I'd never once heard. My father hadn't abandoned us. There had been a custody dispute in the first year after the separation, and my mother, frightened of losing primary custody in a contentious filing, had gone to a family court and alleged a pattern of behavior from my father that Faustina swore to this day had never actually happened. A protective order followed. Contact became legally restricted, then functionally impossible, then over years simply non-existent, because nobody on the outside of that decision ever explained to a 9-year-old why her father had disappeared. He hadn't chosen to leave. He'd been kept out by a story my mother told a courtroom the same way she later told it to me, just wearing a different set of details for each audience. A courtroom got fear and allegation. A 9-year-old got abandonment and blame. Both versions served the same purpose. Neither of them was true. I sat with Faustina's phone call for 2 full days before I did anything else. I needed to actually understand what I'd find if I looked. Before I looked, the same instinct I bring to every restoration project: know what a damaged recording is supposed to sound like before you start correcting it, or you risk fixing it into something it never actually was. I drove out to the county courthouse myself the following week on a day I'd blocked off from client work specifically for this. Family court records from a case that old involving a minor are heavily restricted, and I couldn't access the full file. But the clerk, once I explained I was the child named in the case, was able to confirm the case existed, confirm a protective order had been filed, and later, years afterward, quietly expired without renewal, and confirmed that my father had never once been convicted of anything never charged because the allegation itself had never gone further than my mother's initial filing. An allegation is not evidence. It doesn't have to be true to work exactly the way she needed it to. I remember standing in that courthouse hallway for a long time, holding a printed confirmation slip that told me almost nothing on paper and everything about the shape of my entire childhood. Before I said anything to my mother, I did one more thing. I'm not entirely proud of, but I want to be honest about it, the way I've tried to be honest about everything else here. I drove to her memory care facility 2 days before I was ready to actually confront her, and I sat in the parking lot for close to 20 minutes without going in. I wasn't investigating anything anymore. I think I just needed to see the building know exactly where this conversation was going to happen before I let myself have it. I restored the remaining reels over the following week. 29 more recordings spanning 11 years, my father's voice aging in real time across them from a man in his 30s trying to explain a disappearance to a 9-year-old who couldn't hear him, to a man well into his 50s near the end of the run, saying almost resigned that he didn't know if I'd ever hear any of this, but that he needed to keep making them anyway because the alternative was letting the silence be the last thing between us. He died 4 years ago. I was told at the time that he'd passed quietly alone, no real details offered. I hadn't asked for many. I understand now why that felt easier for everyone except him. I looked up his obituary again after Faustina's call, the same brief notice I'd skimmed once 4 years ago and never revisited. It was 3 sentences long. Survived by a sister. No mention of children. I remember reading that the first time and feeling nothing, because I didn't know yet what I was supposed to feel about a man I'd already decided had chosen to disappear from my life, Reading it again, knowing what I know now, felt like reading a stranger's summary of a person I'd only just started to actually meet. I brought a small speaker with me the day I finally visited my mother with the truth in hand. Not the whole box, just one reel. The first one, the one recorded the month she told me he left. She was having a clearer day, thankfully sharp enough to hold a full conversation, which made what came next both possible and, in its own way, harder. I sat across from her in the small common room, and I didn't explain anything first. I just pressed play. His voice filled that room, saying my name the way he always had, wrong syllable emphasized the same family joke nobody else ever got right. My mother went very still. She said quietly that she didn't know what that was. I told her I did. I told her I'd verified the dates independently spoken to Faustina, confirmed the court filing at the courthouse myself. I told her I had 30 more reels exactly like this one spanning 11 years, and that I finally understood why they'd never reached me. She didn't deny the protective order. What she said instead was that she'd been terrified back then of losing me in a system that rarely favored mothers who couldn't prove financial stability on their own, that she'd told herself the allegation would only matter for a little while, just long enough to secure custody, and that somewhere in the years after admitting what she'd done had started to feel more impossible than simply letting the original story stand. She said at one point that every year she didn't correct it made the next year harder to correct it in, until the lie had simply become load-bearing, holding up too much of both our lives to safely remove. I asked her the question that actually mattered to me more than any of the legal details. I asked if she would have ever told me the truth herself if I hadn't found that box. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something I don't think I'll ever fully stop turning over. She said she honestly didn't know anymore some days what was actually true, and what she'd told herself for so long that it had simply become the truth in her own head. I understood sitting there that I wasn't only losing time with my mother to a story she'd built decades ago. I was losing my chance at a clean answer to dementia settling in around the edges of whatever honesty might have still been possible. That's the part of this I need you to sit with, because it isn't the satisfying ending you might be hoping for. There was no full confession, no complete reckoning. Just a woman who did something unforgivable out of real fear a long time ago, and who may not fully remember by next year that she ever did it at all. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. I just sat with her a while longer, the reel still spinning quietly on the small speaker between us. My father's voice looping back to the beginning of the recording on its own, saying my name again. I want to pause here because I know some of you have lost a parent to something other than death distance estrangement, a story someone else told about them that you believed for years. If that's you, I see you genuinely, and I think the last part of this matters most for exactly that reason. The delayed piece of all this came about 2 weeks after that visit, when Faustina mailed me one more thing she'd been holding for years, without knowing quite what to do with it, a photograph of my father holding me as an infant, on the back of which, in his handwriting, he'd written a date and a single line, "For whenever she's ready to hear the rest." Faustina said she'd never known what the rest meant until I called her. I think it meant exactly what I found in that attic box, 31 reels at a time over 11 years he never stopped trying. I finally told Rowan everything about a week after visiting Faustina, sitting on a video call late on a Sunday, because he couldn't get away from work to come see me in person. He was quiet for a long time after I finished explaining it, longer than I expected, and then he said something I hadn't anticipated, that he'd always had a vague, uneasy feeling about the whole story, even as a kid. Something about the way our mother told it that never quite sat right, though he'd never had a reason strong enough to push on it. He asked if he could hear one of the tapes sometime. I told him he could hear all of them whenever he was ready. He hasn't asked again yet. I don't think he's ready. I'm trying not to rush him toward something that took me 3 full weeks in a locked box to actually face myself. I finished restoring the last tape on a Tuesday evening alone in my studio, the same way I'd started 3 weeks earlier. I sat with all 31 reels labeled and archived properly, now the way I'd archive anything meant to actually last, and I let myself cry for the first time since this whole thing started, not from anger mostly, but from 11 years of a man's voice trying to reach a version of me that never got to hear it in time. I visit my mother every week still. Some visits she remembers this conversation. Most lately she doesn't. I've stopped needing her to. I've started playing her the reels sometimes anyway on the clearer days not to punish her, just because I think some part of her even now might want to hear him too. Some of those visits she asks who the voice on the recording belongs to, as though she's hearing it for the first time, genuinely curious rather than defensive. And I've come to understand that, as its own strange mercy, the dementia taking the guilt from her in pieces the same way it's taking everything else, leaving behind only the sound of a man's voice she apparently doesn't have to reckon with anymore. I used to think I wanted her to remember fully, to sit permanently in the weight of what she'd done. I'm not sure I want that anymore. I think I just want on the days it's possible for both of us to hear him. I still do restoration work every day, other people's damaged recordings, other families' half-lost histories, and I understand the job differently now than I did 3 weeks ago. I used to think the hardest part of this work was technical, getting a fragile old reel to play cleanly one more time. I know now the harder part is what happens after it does, when the voice on it says something you were never supposed to hear, and you have to decide what to do with the rest of your life once you have. If any part of this hit close to home, if you've ever found the one piece of proof that rewrote a story you'd believed about your own family for years, I see you genuinely. Grief and betrayal don't usually arrive separately in my experience. Usually they come tangled together in the same box, the same silence, the same story someone told you because the truth felt too dangerous to survive. And if you liked watching someone use exactly the skill nobody expected her to turn toward the truth of her own life, watch my latest video next. You will not see what she finds there coming either.